Domine, secundum eloquium tuum, et vivam.
The first question is, what thoughts are going through your mind and heart as you prepare to profess solemn vows tomorrow? When I was a young person, I was really attracted to extreme activities. I loved surfing and skating and parkour and mixed martial arts. And I think in some ways that zeal is part of what drew me to the monastic life in the first place. Because when I was around 16 or 17, I started reading some of the church fathers. And what particularly stood out to me about them was how extreme their life was. Augustine, in his book Confessions, in book 3, he says that he hated the safety of a course free from pitfalls. And I remember being struck by men like him who had this similar zeal, but their expression of extreme and intense living wasn't in doing backflips off of cliffs and things like that. It was in the spiritual life, in retreating to places in the desert and living a life of prayer and asceticism. And I remember as a young person thinking, these guys are the most extreme people that I've ever heard of. And that, I think, impression as a young person developed further and eventually led me here to the monastic life. So what I've been thinking about as I approach my solemn profession is I think this is going to be the most extreme thing I've ever done. I've done a lot of crazy things, but taking lifelong vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and stability, it doesn't get more radical than that. So question 2 is, what has been the greatest source of strength to help you persevere through your years of initial formation? I think it's crucial as you are being formed in any kind of religious vocation is to really be honest with yourself and honest about what you're feeling at any moment. Sometimes when we feel negative thoughts or are trapped in seasons of doubt, we feel like failures and would rather subvert those feelings instead of being honest and allowing them to surface. Thankfully, in the monastic life, we chant through the Psalms every 2 weeks. And once we finish chanting through the Psalms, we chant through them again. And what's special about the Psalms is that they capture every array of human emotion. It contains the joyful, happy emotions that we experience as human beings, but also the not so happy emotions. And I think that it's very key that those are included in our prayer life because they are a reminder to us to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with God about where we're at. So as you're persevering in a vocation, I think it's absolutely crucial that you bring your whole self to God, your authentic self, not this masked, pious self that has this sort of idyllic halo behind your head, but the true self, and allow that self to be in communication with God through prayer and with one another. So the third question is, what kind of advice or words of wisdom can you give to someone who might be discerning a vocation to religious life? I remember when I was a postulant and I was approaching my simple vows, which last for 3 years in our order. And I remember approaching Father Philip, who had been in vows for 75 years at this point. And I asked him, Father Philip, were you afraid before you made your first profession? And he said to me, well, my generation doesn't struggle with commitment issues like yours does. And he's right. There's something particularly scary about making commitments, long-term commitments for people in my generation. And I think part of the reason why is because we have so many excellent options in front of us. And as soon as you commit, that is saying yes to one option, but no to so many. And what if those other options are more appealing? And how can we ever know unless we find out? But how can we ever find out unless we try them all? And so we end up being stuck in this sort of paralysis of this inability to actually stand our ground in anything for a long time. We move from one city to another, or find one relationship to another, go from one religious community to another. And ultimately, I think what this ends up doing is it keeps us from becoming who God called us to be. So for those who are considering a religious vocation, I would actually remind them of the words of Saint Benedict, who says to keep death before you daily, to remind yourself that life on earth is short. And if you remind yourself daily that you're going to die, then you'll be less inclined to procrastinate and waste any of your time. I think when we remind ourselves that death will come, and we don't know when it will for each person, but when we remind ourselves of that, we'll be inspired to live more intensely and to live for the purpose that God has called us to live for. So remind yourself that death is before us, and don't be afraid to commit, because it's only once we commit to something that we can actually begin living the life that God has called us to believe. Fourth question is there anything specifically you are looking forward to after your profession? Well, I just graduated with my MA in theology at the Dominican House of Studies, and I wrote my thesis on Athanasius of Alexandria. And so after I profess solemn vows, I look forward to applying for PhD programs and continuing my studies in patristics as a doctoral student, and continuing to learn more from the men and women who inspired me to become a monk in the first place. Ancient Christians in the 3rd through 7th centuries who inspired me to live a radical life for God.